Thank you. Establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding, and voting. Members participating remotely must continue to use software platforms' video function while attending the proceedings unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render the member unable to fully participate on camera. If a member who is participating remotely experiences technical difficulties, please contact the committee staff for assistance and they will help you get reconnected. When recognized, video of remotely attending members' participation will be broadcast in the room and via the television internet feeds. Members participating remotely are asked to mute their microphone when they are not speaking. Doing so will help to ensure that remote technology works properly. Members participating remotely will be recognized normally for asking questions, but if they want to speak at another time, they must seek recognition verbally by unmuting their phones. Members should be aware that there is a slight lag of a few seconds between the time you start speaking and the camera shot switching to you. To account for this, please do a, quote, preamble, whatever that means, unquote, in your remarks before you get to your actual question. Members who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on for the entirety of the time they attend the proceeding. Those members may leave and rejoin the proceedings. If the members depart for a short period of time for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, they should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin if they return. Members are also advised that I've designated a committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt the proceedings. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues. Finally, remotely participating members should see a 5-minute countdown clock on the software's platform display, but if necessary, I will gently remind members when their time is up. So welcome, everyone. Today, we will be focusing on racial disparity in the military justice system. We are here to discuss the inequalities and injustices that people of color experience in the military justice system, including those in criminal investigations, courts-martial, and non-judicial punishment. The fact that we live in a country with ingrained racial bias in no way excuses or justifies the perpetuation of racism in the United States military. Our service members commit their lives to protect our country. We must commit ourselves to ensure that the military treats service members of color equally and justly. We will not solve this problem by hiding it or denying it. We will not solve this problem pretending that it is solely the result of uncontrollable societal problems by pretending that our actions do not contribute to the continuation of injustice, by refusing to seek change because we are so comfortable and confident in, quote, the ways things have always been done, unquote. The way things have always been done is wrong. The results are repugnant. I hope that all our military leaders in the room are prepared to acknowledge the need for a reckoning and prepared further to institute bold measures to fix the inherent bias in the military justice system in America. GAO's most recent report found that Black service members were more likely to be the subject of recorded investigations and more likely to be tried in general and special courts-martial than their white counterparts. Importantly, GAO found that the results were statistically significant. Racial data on non-judicial punishment was not uniformly collected. Protect Our Defenders, in their investigation, found that Black airmen were twice as likely to face non-judicial punishment than white airmen. Yet history provides us some solace. The military led the way in integrating our Black service members long before schools or lunch counters were integrated. In 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, directing equal treatment for our Black service members in the military. Subsequently, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps complied, quote, in 1949, the Air Force issued a, quote, Bill of Rights for black airmen, and the Navy proposed a recruiting program to enlist black sailors. The Marine Corps eliminated its segregated training platoons and various post facilities, unquote. But integration did not equal acceptance. Racism and discrimination, both personal and institutional, continued. People of color who wish to make a career in our military have faced an uphill fight, and we've done too little to assist them. 72 years after integration, the fight for equality and justice continues. We still struggle to carve out an equal place for people of color, struggle to ensure they have the same opportunities to serve and advance in their careers, and struggle to ensure them equal justice. We have to look no further than the military leaders in this country, almost exclusively white men. It was heartening to note that General Charles Brown has become the Air Force Chief of Staff just this week. But 72 years? I would like to hear from the first panel what needs to change, what needs to be done to bring transparency to the system and ensure accountability for every commander who uses the military justice system in a biased and discriminatory manner. For the second panel, I would like to hear how, as the senior military lawyer for each service, you could educate leaders at all levels to recognize bias in the military justice system and what you can do to ensure that justice is dispensed fairly and consistently. Before I introduce our first panel, let me offer Ranking Member Kelly an opportunity to make his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairwoman Spear, and thank the witnesses for being here tomorrow. Thank you for holding this hearing at such a fitting time. As Americans across this country of all backgrounds are struggling to better understand racial disparity across society at large and to take substantive actions that actually make a difference, this is a fitting time to have this hearing. I want to welcome both of our panels to today's hearing. We appreciate your attention and commitment to remedy a very grave problem that, if left unchecked, could stand to undermine the readiness of our armed forces. Racial disparity is a very real societal problem. And across various criminal justice systems, we see lopsided rates of arrest, prosecution, and incarceration that should concern every American. This country has struggled to confront and fix that problem for decades, and we continue to do so. But as the events of the last several weeks demonstrate, we have a long way to go. As a former district attorney and city prosecutor, I have seen my share of it, and it is something neither I nor any of us can ever shy away from or get complacent about. This is a problem we all collectively need to confront head on. Where do I think we can and must make a very real difference is in our military. I've served in the military for over 33 years, commanded at the battalion and brigade levels, and I know the very real bond our young warriors share regardless of background. I was very proud 2 weeks ago when 371 soldiers from Mississippi in the 155 Armor Brigade Combat Team, all volunteers, answered the call and deployed to Washington for the civil unrest on 3 hours' notice. They were a very diverse group with 43% from either African American or minority backgrounds. They trained together, they deployed together, and they did their duty as a team together, which is what makes our military so great. They answered the call, did what they were asked to do, and they did it with honor and integrity. They and all service members place their trust in each other and their leaders, and that is why our military is so formidable. This is in context that lays a bit of the foundation for what makes this disparity in military justice so troubling for me. Leaders need to do the right thing, always. Treat every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine with dignity and respect, and protect that trust that binds warriors together. If racial disparity persists, it always has a negative impact on recruiting, readiness, and the culture of our military. I understand the statistics, the effect, but what we need to understand is the cause, fashion the right remedies, and we need to do it quickly. Section 5401 of the FY 2020 NDAA tasks the SecDef in consultation with the services to evaluate the causes of racial, ethnic, and gender disparities in the military justice system and to take steps to remedy disparities. I'm interested in hearing from our witnesses today on any ideas for rooting out the cause of this problem and potential solutions, and where the department is in their evaluation of causes and remedies. I understand the Air Force is initiating an Inspector General investigation with panels of experts in support to explore the problem more holistically. I'm interested in hearing from all the services about any similar or complementary initiatives. I do note that the Space Force is not here today, and as a new force, I think they have a chance to get it right from the start. They can be groundbreaking and ground setting because they start from zero. Madam Chairwoman, I think this is a great start, and I look forward to today's discussion. I want to again thank the witnesses for attending today's hearing and share their collective expertise with us, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Each witness will have the opportunity to present his or her testimony, and each member will have an opportunity to question the witnesses for 5 minutes. We respectfully ask the witnesses to summarize their testimony in 5 minutes. Your written comments and statements will be made part of the hearing record. I ask unanimous consent that non-subcommittee members be allowed to participate and ask questions after all the subcommittee members have had the opportunity to ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. Let me welcome our first panel, retired Colonel Don Christensen, President of Protect Our Defenders, and Ms. Brenda Farrell, Director of Defense Capabilities and Management Team of the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Ms. Farrell is joining us via WebEx. Welcome. All right, let us begin with Colonel Christensen.
Chairwoman Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to examine the issue of racial disparities in the military justice system. Like our country, the military has a long and painful history of mistreating racial minorities. Black service members have continued to be prosecuted and punished at a much greater rate than white counterparts. Moreover, they suffer promotion rates and are lower promotion rates and are vastly underrepresented in the officer corps, especially at the general and flag officer ranks. As part of Protect Our Defenders' ongoing efforts to improve the fairness of the military justice system, in 2016 we filed a series of Freedom of Information Act requests to each service seeking 10 years of data on the racial disparities in the military justice process. The data was provided to us in rates per 1,000. After eventually receiving the data, we released a study of our findings in June of 2017 that showed widespread racial disparities in all of the services. We examined a total of 32 years of data, and in every single year, black service members were punished at a significantly higher rate than white service members. Based on our findings, Congress mandated a Government Accountability Office review of the disparities, which was completed in March of 2019. The GAO also found significant racial disparities, but most shockingly, the GAO found that none of the services had done anything to find the causes or solutions for the disparities. As part of its answer to our 2016 FOIA request, the Air Force stated it had created, quote, a cross-functional team led by diversity inclusion experts, end quote, to, quote, collect and analyze the data and recommend policy changes, process modifications, or additional study as appropriate. In July of 2017, we filed an additional FOIA request seeking the identities and the qualifications of the team members, as well as the team's findings and recommendations, in addition to other information. This was the start of a grueling 3-year-long struggle to force the Air Force to meet its FOIA obligations. Thankfully, we were represented by the Yale Veterans Legal Services Clinic, which enabled us to file suit in federal court. Despite numerous efforts by the Air Force to conceal its findings and recommendations of the team, a federal judge eventually ordered the Air Force to disclose the requested documents under the threat of sanctions. The documents we received were startling. The panel and follow-up study by Air Force Manpower, or A1, found that the racial disparities were, quote, consistent and persistent and getting worse. The Air Force admitted that the numbers were, quote, concerning and the importance of having, quote, equitable and consistent disciplinary processes. These findings were made in 2016, and despite concluding that the that the Air Force, quote, must clearly address the disparity in some way, quote, end quote, the Air Force appeared to act on the team's recommendations and address the issues. Another disturbing finding of our review of the documents is the Air Force legal community's efforts to discredit the data showing, their own data, showing significant racial disparities. Despite the strong conclusions of A1, JA has attempted to discredit the importance of the data. Specifically in the background paper that JA created in 2016, they claimed that the disparity between blacks and whites that are punished can be a result of a small number of additional actions. Lieutenant General Rockwell, the Air Force Judge Advocate General, reinforced this message recently in a briefing to the Air Force 4-stars, where he told them, quote, even a few additional disciplinary actions have a far greater impact on the rate per thousand for black airmen, end quote, due to their smaller number. General Rockwell then went on to misleadingly illustrate this point by using a ratio of 10-to-1 of white airmen to black airmen rather than the actual rate of 5-to-1. The idea that the decades-long disparity can be explained by a few additional disciplinary actions is false, and JA needs to stop this line of argument. The disparity in non-judicial punishments in calendar year 19 in the Air Force alone represents an additional 520 Article 15s for black airmen, not an additional few as implied by the legal world. In other words, black airmen received approximately 1,105 Article 15s last year. If they were punished at the same proportional rate as white airmen, they would have only received 585. The impact of racial disparities across all the services in the last 10 years would easily be in excess of 10,000 additional extra punishments meted out against black airmen or black service members, not a few additional actions. The Air Force needs to focus on finding solutions and causes, not discrediting the significance of its own data. We released our report in May 26th of this year, and it had an immediate impact. I credit Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force Wright and General Goldfein for acting quickly by ordering an investigation. But what must not be forgotten is the action initiated by the Air Force last week to investigate disparities would not have occurred if they had been successful in keeping this information from being disclosed. This hearing today would not have been held but for the fact we were willing to force the Air Force to disclose damning information that it wished to keep hidden. This is a reminder of the importance of transparency and why the military must faithfully meet its FOIA obligations. How much further could the Air Force be in addressing the racial disparities if it had put the energy into finding solutions in 2016 rather than seeking to cover up its embarrassing failures? I look forward to any questions you may have.
All right, now we are going to hear from Ms. Brenda Farrell from the GAO that has recently provided the report. Ms. Farrell?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Ranking Member Kelly and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss GAO's findings and recommendations about racial disparities in the military justice system. The Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, was established to provide the statutory framework of the military justice system. It contains articles that punish traditional crimes, such as unlawful drug use and assault, as well as unique military offenses, including desertion. Every active duty service member of the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard are subject to the UCMJ, with more than 258,000 individuals disciplined from fiscal years 2013 through 2017. A key principle of the UCMJ is that a fair and just system of military law can foster a highly disciplined force. My statement is based on our report issued in May 2019. on the military services capabilities to assess racial disparities, among other matters. Let me briefly summarize my written statement. My statement is divided into 3 parts. The first part addresses the collection of race and ethnic group information in the military services investigations, military justice, and personnel databases. Among our findings, we found that the services did not collect information about race and ethnic group in these databases. Thus, they were limited in their ability to identify disparities, which are instances in which a racial or ethnic group was overrepresented. Specifically, the number of potential responses for race and ethnic group within the 15 databases across the services ranges from 5 to 32 options for race and 2 to 25 options for ethnic group, which can complicate cross-service assessments. To address these inconsistencies, we made recommendations to DoD and DHS, the parent organization for the Coast Guard, to collect and maintain race and ethnic information in the investigative and personnel databases using the same categories recently established in the uniform standards for the military justice databases. DoD and DHS concurred with these recommendations. The second part of my statement addresses the extent of racial disparities in investigations, disciplinary actions, and outcomes. Since the services did not collect race and ethnic group data consistently, we analyzed actions initiated and recorded in each service's investigations, military justice, and personnel databases between the fiscal years 2013 through 2017. To help ensure we had consistent profiles for service members, we merged records using unique identifiers, such as Social Security numbers that were common among a military services database. We used OMB standards to consolidate the various race and ethnic values. We conducted multivariate regression analyses to test the association between a service member's characteristics, such as race and ethnic group, and the odds of a military justice action. By using this approach with available data, we found an association of disparity at stages of the military justice process, but findings are inconclusive regarding other stages. For example, we found that Black service members were more likely than white service members to be subjects of recorded investigations in the military criminal investigative databases in all the services. Further, Black service members were more likely than white service members to be tried in general and special court-martials in the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force. Data for the Coast Guard was not available. The last part of my statement addresses DoD evaluating the causes of disparities. We found that DoD has not comprehensively evaluated the causes of racial disparities in the military justice system. We recommended that they do so to better position them to identify actions to address disparities. DoD concurred. Madam Chairwoman, in conclusion, we believe that for the system of military law to be recognized as fair and just by both service members and by the American public, DoD and DHS need to take actions to implement the recommendations in our May 2019 report. That concludes my statement, and I'll be pleased to take questions that you or the others may have.
Ms. Harrell, thank you. You did it with 8 seconds to left. So let us start with Colonel Christensen. You know, I was stunned in reading the report that you found that in the Air Force, a Black service member was 71% more likely to be charged for non-judicial punishment, I believe, for court-martials or non-judicial punishment. In the Army, it was 61%. In the Navy, it was 40% more likely. And the Marine Corps, it was 32% more likely. So clearly, the Air Force is the grossest outlier, although they all appear to have statistics that bear a high degree of bias. It appears to me that you had to work very hard to get that FOIA request complied with. How much time did it take for you to actually get that information from the Air Force?
Well, that's a great question. So there were two separate FOIA requests. The first one, where we just asked for the raw data, we got fairly quickly. The Air Force answered, I believe, within a month with just raw data. But in that first FOIA request, they talked about establishing this disparity panel. I thought, hey, great, they're really going to look at this. And when we did the follow-up, it's been 3 years since we filed that FOIA request, and we still have not got all the documents that we requested. For example, I have no idea what the qualifications of a single person on that panel were. And we had to go to federal court. We filed suit in December of 2017. We did not get a final judgment from the judge until March of this year. So it was an onerous task. I mean, we were very fortunate to have a great group of Yale law students and Yale law professors who were willing to fight this, but the average person looking for FOIA evidence cannot get that kind of support.
And so it was over a year and 3 months before you got the data that you requested, and
Well, it was over 3 years.
over 3 years.
3 years. Yes, it was a 3-year struggle. The first request, we took about 6 months for everybody to get the information to us. But when it came to the disparity panel, its findings and its recommendations, that was a 3-year struggle.
So after your report came out with the stunning statistics, when did you hear from the Air Force?
I've never heard from the Air Force.
From any of the other services?
I have never heard from any of the services. None of the services reached out to us to talk about the report or findings.
What do you think the military should do to show that it's taking these disparities seriously?
Well, I think the first thing we need to realize is that this is information that I know the Air Force has tracked for decades, back to at least the 80s, and nothing was ever done. So there's a long track record of doing nothing. When our first report came out in 2017, that was an opportunity. It had been put into the public light, got a lot of media coverage. Congress was concerned about it. That was an opportunity to show they were going to do something about it. They haven't. General Goldfein, I think, took the first step by ordering the investigation. But the thing to remember about that investigation, that's an internal Air Force investigation by the IG who works for General Goldfein. They need to be looking at outside sources to come in and talk to them about that. Experts on disparity, who truly people understand what the causes are. And I think one of the things they have to accept, because what we have seen to the limited degree they have looked at it, they have tried to look at exclusively unconscious bias. They have to accept that there is also actual bias. There are actually people who are prejudiced serving in the military. I don't think it's most. I don't know if it's many, but we do have that. There was a naval officer who was just accidentally disclosed his racist beliefs on Facebook by live streaming a conversation between him and his wife that was horrifically racist. He was an academy grad and a retired captain. We have to accept that this isn't just implicit or unconscious bias, that there are people who don't like black people or other minorities and don't want them in the military, and they have to try to root this out. But leadership needed to stand up decades ago. It needed to stand up in 2016. It needed to stand up in 2017. It needed to stand up in 2019. It has to show that they really care about this.
Ms. Farrell, where are you? What would you want us to make sure that the Department of Defense does moving forward?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. As I noted in my statement, we think implementation of our recommendations are key. In fact, I think the recommendations in our report are a roadmap for DoD, with the final chapter being the causes of the disparity and taking steps to make corrections. I think continued oversight in this area is necessary, especially as my colleague on the panel has noted, these disparities have been lingering for some time. Now we have hard, reliable data to help pinpoint where there are differences so that DoD can target where to start looking for the causes of these. So I think continued oversight is necessary. We noted in the report that the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020 had provisions that were consistent with several of our recommendations. Some deadlines have been set in terms of when DoD must begin to look at, say, the causes of disparities, but there's not an end date. I think it was recognized that more data was needed, and this was going to be a very complex review. But in order to make sure that that report is completed, I think congressional oversight is going to be very important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairwoman Spear. And first, the cause of racial disparity across society and across the military service is elusive, except for those who are blatantly racist. And there are those in every organization, including the military. What recommendations, if any, do you have that would be helpful to the departments in getting after the causation and fashioning of remedies, and also understanding the causation that aren't those that are intentional, those cultural or whatever disparities that are caused by culture? What remedies would y'all have?
Thank you, Ranking Member Kelly. Well, I think General Goldfein's taken a first good step on that by actually getting the input from the rank and file of the services. We've heard from Protect Our Defenders since our first report came out, a second report from a lot of black service members who are talking about what they're experiencing. I think the Air Force particularly is an incredibly white officer corps. The fighter pilot community is less than 3% black. And so I think there's a lack of understanding what the black service members and other minority service members are facing, the difficulties they face, the lack of mentorship. In 2015, Air Force Times ran a really good article about promotion failures for black service members, failures to get definite promotes, the failure to get in residence PME. And so getting the service members at the top to understand that there are issues that are impacting the way blacks progress throughout the military and other minorities progress is really a key to that.
And second, I want to understand the significance of years of service on this analysis. As I recall in the GAO report, you included years of service in your analysis for the Air Force data, but not the other services because it closely correlated with rank. Are we looking at generally a problem that is focused primarily on youngest service members across the services? And if so, how does this data compare nationally to trends? And for you, ma'am.
Thank you for that question. We did do a bivariate regression analysis as well as a multivariate where we would control for certain characteristics such as years of service or rank, and each service model was a little bit different. We worked very closely with the services in order to understand what was going on with their particular service. As far as a comparison between older and younger, we did not develop that particular analysis to target in terms of that. We are aware of some studies that are done in the private sector, but we did not try to make any comparisons of what's going on in the military justice system with what's going on in the civil justice system. I hope that answers your question.
It does. And back to Mr. Christensen, or Colonel Christensen, I'm sorry. I want to go back in my career. When I first got in 30-something years ago, I think I had the first African-American first sergeant in the Mississippi Army National Guard that served under my command. But over there, so you rarely saw any senior NCOs. I can name on one hand the senior 05, 06 level officers who were African-American in the Mississippi National Guard, which is Mississippi's 40% African-American. Now, I can't count. And many of those are my soldiers who I mentored. I personally made a difference, who are sergeant majors, sergeant first class, who are first sergeants. The last three brigade commanders that followed me as a brigade commander are all African-American, not because they're African-American, because they're the best we got, the absolute best. So now it is there. So you served as part, during the data that we collected from 2010 to 2014, you served in the Air Force in one of the chief legal roles. So what did you see? And what did you do? And now, with the experience you have now, what would you do now different to change the outcome of what happens in the Air Force, Colonel Christensen?
No, that's a great question, and I agree. The Army actually is further ahead in Officer Corps being African American. The Air Force lags behind the rest. What did I see? Look, I never prosecuted someone that I thought was innocent. Of course, I don't make the prosecution decision. Somebody else does, as you know. I don't think it was necessarily a case that innocent people were being brought to trial. What I thought the problem was is that others were getting the benefit of the doubt based upon whether the relationship, implicit bias, explicit bias, whatever it was, they were getting the benefit of the doubt. So, for example, 2 years ago, the Air Force decided to prosecute a black NCO for being 6 minutes late to work, literally 6 minutes late to a meeting, and he has a court-martial conviction. That's a decision that truly should not have been made. I don't care if it was an Article 15 turned around or not, just the optics of it. What did I do? Well, one thing I was very concerned about and raised as an issue was the lack of black JAGs. We do not have enough. We have one of the great former ones sitting behind me, Colonel Orr. But when I retired, I believe we had one of 124 colonels in the JAG Corps were African American. So I encouraged the African Americans that worked for me to try to make a career out of it, to be concerned about it. I sat on on a selection board. I encouraged the people who also sat on that selection board to focus on finding good African Americans to come into the JAG Corps, because I think part of that experience that they would bring in would be important to help with that bias. What have I done since? Obviously, filing this report, it was important to me. I knew the data was there. It had troubled me throughout my career. I never saw leadership really address it, and I thought it was important to bring it forward.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Were white NCOs that were 6 minutes late courts-martialed?
I have never seen anybody court-martialed with the sole offense of being 6 minutes late to a meeting other than this African American.
It's really stunning. All right, Ms. Davis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to our witnesses, thank you for joining us. Colonel Christensen, first off, can you talk maybe without getting in the weeds too much, a little bit about how you gathered your statistical information, and I just wanted to get a sense of your statistical analysis, whether that was very different from Ms. Farrell's, and then I'll ask Ms. Farrell if just talking about that, and whether you think information was concealed, and sort of your level of confidence, I guess, with the analysis, and whether it revealed sort of really what you're trying to get at here. How do we do that?
Thank you, Congresswoman Davis. So for the initial FOIA request, we requested from each service 10 years of data showing their rate per thousand of court-martial in Article 15 for African American, whites, and other minorities. We received that data from everyone. Except for the Navy, only gave us 2 years of data. The Coast Guard never responded. The data we got from the Air Force was the best. I knew their process would track it well. I'm very confident that the data that they provide us is accurate, and that what we saw out of that data was a historical disparity of racial, where blacks were prosecuted and given Article 15s at a much greater rate, and that it was getting worse, not better. And that's what we saw across all the services. The Army did not track non-judicial punishments. The Marine Corps only tracked by convictions. They didn't, so we don't know how many cases were charged, just convictions. The Marine Corps was interesting as the more severe the punishment, the greater the disparity. So, for example, by the time we got to general courts-martial in the Marine Corps, the disparity was almost 2.6 times greater for blacks than it was for whites.
Thank you.
The issue we dealt with cover-up was when we did the follow-on about the racial disparity panel that the Air Force said that they established.
And Ms. Farrell, could you respond to that? And are there some differences or areas, again, that you didn't feel that you were able to get the information and really had some sort of lack of confidence maybe in some of that data?
Sure, I'll be happy to expand upon our methodology. Our methodology was for a different time period than Don's. His was a much longer. Ours focused on the fiscal year 2013 to 2017, which was the data, that latest available data. We experienced very good cooperation from the Department of Defense. This was a very rigorous analysis. As I noted, we obtained the records, all the records for that period between fiscal year 2013 and 2017 in three categories of 15 databases across the services. There were some places where data was incomplete, and that's the reason we say that we found disparities that were statistically significant at certain stages of the military justice process, but at other stages, the findings are inconclusive, and it's usually inconclusive for two reasons. One, incomplete data, not that any of the service did not provide the data, but the data was incomplete, such as non-judicial punishments. The data was incomplete for the Army and the Navy, as well as the Coast Guard. So it was very inconclusive. But we received very good cooperation from DOD. The analysis that GAO did in cobbling all this information together takes time. It's not something that DOD could do routinely in an efficient manner. That's why it's so important for them to carry out the recommendation to adapt their personnel and their investigative databases to have the same uniform standards as the military justice, so that going forward, especially if the causes of disparities are identified and steps are taken to remedy those, you want to be sure you have good data in place in order to be able to find that progress.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I hope that in our next discussion we'll get into those causes. Certainly. But Colonel Christensen, going back to you very, very quickly, I know you tend to, and really in your analysis felt it was important to look at legally trained military prosecutors. But I guess within the judicial system, we would probably all agree that there is some bias there. How do you think that's different?
In the military, how could it be different, if I'm understanding your question?
Yes. Well, I think rather than leaning on the commanders, the military, legally trained military prosecutors, is that a different kind of bias that they would bring to their positions? Well, recognizing that there's always some implicit bias within the judicial system, of course, as well as in the military and as well as in society. But do you see that as different, and why would that recommendation be there?
Well, as I agree with Ranking Member Kelly, there's always bias no matter what system we have, and that's unfortunate. The reason we talk about that is the bias that the commander who has the power to make that decision is he knows the accused. He also knows the person he chose not to prosecute or not to give an Article 15 to. Whereas as a prosecutor, I never knew anybody until I walked into court. So I could not have a bias against them one way or the other. And so that's where I think the key is that there's an inherent bias in the chain of command when they know the people involved. If they haven't established the same kind of relationships with the African Americans that work for them as they have with the white service members that work for them, I think it's going to have a negative impact.
And you feel that the prosecutors wouldn't bring that kind of bias, at least in maybe what are other biases that they
actually, Ms. Davis, you've gone over a minute 51. So
okay. Great. All right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Next, we have Ms. Escobar. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman, and many thanks to our panelists. You know, Colonel Christensen, it's really interesting that you mentioned the Coast Guard, because I just recently read a report about the Coast Guard, which obviously is under the Department of Homeland Security, not DOD. but the report by the Inspector General found that incidents of racial harassment were not, there were no consequences for cadets who used racial slurs against their fellow cadets. Absolutely no consequences, and there was a history of this. And so I think one of the things that we are going to need to do is really kind of take a look at really a broad sense of causality, including whether folks are punished for using racial slurs, et cetera. But to both of you, and I know we're going to get into this more in the next panel, but as we're talking about the causative factors, what would you say, just based on the research that you have done, what are the causative factors in these disparities in the research that you have found?
Well, and that's the excellent question, and it goes beyond what my expertise is, and what the data that we have is the data shows us is a problem, and that's what we were hoping that the military, each service would do once the problem was brought publicly to light to them, that they would look for the causes. I mean, we're limited on what access we have on that, but just as someone who served for 23 years and has served all of that in the military justice world, I do think that the racial makeup, especially of the Air Force leadership, without a doubt has some impact on the disparities that we have. General Hyten, when he testified at his nomination hearing to become the vice chair,
I was having difficulty hearing.
When he became the vice chair, said that basically the issue of race was behind the military. And that when he looked at the service, it was colorblind as he did it. And that's the problem. There's 2 4-star African-American generals in the entire DOD. So we really need to focus on the inclusion of all races and their voices and understanding the issues that the young Black service members are facing.
Thank you so much. Ms. Farrell, your thoughts and anything come to mind as you were conducting your research?
One of our objectives was to determine what steps DoD had taken to determine causes of disparities. And what we found was there's been some steps, but not a comprehensive review. By steps, there's climate surveys that gain information on perspectives of service members, but going back to the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, there really hasn't been a focus on the military justice system and causes for disparities. We, again, think that our report pointing to certain stages of the military process can help prioritize where to start looking for those causes. And that is a recommendation DoD has agreed with, but also in the National Defense Authorization Act for 2020, there is a provision consistent with that by, I believe it's this month, DoD will proceed with such a study. Commence it. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm quickly running out of time. I just wanted to make note for something with my colleagues and with the chairwoman. We've been talking about this issue for the last year and a half, and it really is important in terms of not just African American service members, but Latinos, and also I'm very curious about the impact on immigrants in our services, especially when we have a commander-in-chief who on disparate treatment as well. But one of the things that we have found is at the highest levels of authority within the military, it's even less diverse. And it may be because of the adverse military judicial system encounters that you all have pointed out. That may be one of the underlying causes. I know I'm just about out of time. Thank you both again for your work, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Escobar. Ms. Luria, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I want to thank Mr. Christensen and Ms. Farrell for joining us today. And I think that this really highlights something. The saying is that justice is blind, but it's showing that justice is not colorblind. And having served myself in the military, having been a commanding officer and been part of the NJP non-judicial punishment process within the command, I think that understanding that and the lack of data that has been collected and the lack of reporting requirements that existed, I think that that's very useful for us to hear as a committee to understand the scope of this problem and get after the true core issues of why a disparity could exist. Ms. Farrell just mentioned in her comments a couple minutes ago the fact that there's command climate data command climate survey data as well that I think can be informative on this, as part of the bigger picture, because we don't necessarily have accurate data for non-judicial punishment in all parts of the military justice system to go off of. But Ms. Farrell, can you elaborate on how command climate data could help inform, what the previous question was about from Ms. Escobar? Could you envision a way that we could try to incorporate that or require the incorporation of that into the analysis? Because that's taken regularly, it's taken from all commands, and it's taken from the perspectives of people who are not only involved themselves personally in an accusation or going through the non-judicial punishment process. So can you elaborate for everyone on how that could maybe be a piece of the data that we need to fully analyze this?
Sure, be happy to elaborate. Command climate surveys are required. I believe DoD has gotten much better in the past few years in making sure that they be administered, thanks to a little help from Congress. They are designed to help an incoming commander understand the working environment and what issues he or she may need to focus on while they have that command. There's usually a standard set of questions that are answered, and then the incoming commander can ask some additional questions. Climate surveys have been very beneficial to obtain perceptions of service members in many personnel areas. I've worked with them looking at hazing as well as other sexual assault issues. So I think the surveys could be reviewed in order to see if there's something that could be gained. We do have to be careful about survey fatigue. We hear that from DoD all the time, but this comes down to where is this issue of racial and ethnic disparities in DoD's priorities. So command climate surveys could have some issues incorporated. The status of forces is another survey of the active duty. There's also another one for the reserve component, the civilians, but that's another one that there's standard questions, but often the questions change. But when an issue is emerging, often DoD uses the status of forces survey to ask a set of questions over a period of a few years to try to dig a little deeper to see what's going on. So there are survey instruments already in use that could be used to perhaps obtain some more information about this particular issue in the military justice system.
Well, thank you for that. And, I think that, as we look at, how we try to collect data to assess the situation, to identify the root causes, that we could consider that there is additional data on top of just statistical data about the types of NJP that happen. And I do think it could also be, somewhat difficult, and I think we have to be very clear on how we collect that data, because different things stop at different phases within the NJP process. Some of them may never reach captain's mast, for example, or office hours, or whatever term the service uses for that process, and some may stop short of that with just assigning extra military instruction and other things. And I think that there is also an aspect in the NJP process with the attempt to maintain good order and discipline, attempt to use the process when there is a supposed infraction to improve the performance of the sailor or the soldier with things such as extra military instruction and things like that, which are clearly required to address specifically the issue at hand and are not viewed as punishment, but are viewed as ways to improve their performance and make them better soldiers or sailors. So I think that, definitely collecting the data is very important, but I appreciate, your work in researching this. And I think that we do need to do more to understand the problem more, to get at the root causes, and training is also an issue as well. I think that as a commanding officer, our only the Navy was specifically the Navy legal justice course. And then there's not really any specific thing that I recall in that training that addressed specifically looking at racial disparities or uniform application of the justice system. So I apologize I've run over, Madam Chair, but thank you again, and I look forward to the next panel as well.
Thank you, Ms. Loria. Now, Ms. Holland, you're recognized for 5 minutes, except you're not there. We'll come back to you. Mr. Cisneros, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I want to thank our panelists for being here today. Colonel Christensen, I'm a product of the Navy's, what used to be the Navy's Affirmative Action Program. I went through this program called Broad and Opportunity for Officer Selection and Training. It took enlisted personnel, people of color, help prepare them for college. So it was part of the Navy's process to get more people of color into the officer ranks. And as you stated, Colonel, 78% of our military officers are white, 8% are African American. It's even lower for Asians and Hispanics. And you talk about the impact of the lack of representation in the officer ranks and how it has disparities in our military justice system. And you also mentioned about, the lack of, when you were in the Air Force, the lack of diversity in the JAG Corps there. But really, what do we need to do as far as recruiting goes to bring these numbers up so that, and really will recruiting more a diverse officer corps really help solve this problem in the criminal justice system in the military of the disparities in it?
Thank you, Congressman. Well, I think, prioritizing, definitely, as you talked about, that opportunity to go from a young enlisted Black service member to become an officer. How do we encourage that process? What are we doing to make sure that the officers have mentorship, and that is so key. How far do you progress in the JAG Corps or any other part of the service depends on who you have for mentors. And so do we have people looking out for those young Black officers and making sure that they can progress? Are they getting the opportunities to go to professional military education and residence, which is a key to getting promoted, especially to the general officer or flag officer rank? And then making sure that they are operating in a good environment. So a story just broke, I believe, this weekend about the racial problems at West Point, and that the cadets there, the African-American cadets, I believe 25% of them said that they've been subjected to racial abuse. And so we got to make sure that at the institutions that are giving us our future leaders, that the people serving and trying to get that commission are treated with respect.
Ms. Farrell, in the 2019 GAO report, it recommended that the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard collect data such as, race, ethnicity, gender, offense and punishment for all non-judicial punishments. Can you elaborate on the importance of collecting this data and update the committee on the service's progress in this area?
Yes. This is an area where the data was inconclusive because those three services had incomplete data to determine the extent of disparities in the non-judicial punishments. What happened was, in conducting our data reliability check, we identified the number of non-judicial cases in the Court of Appeals for the Armed Services annual reports from fiscal year 2013 to 2017, and compared those numbers with the numbers in the services military justice databases, as well as their personnel databases. And we found that for the Army, roughly 65% of the reported cases were not in their databases. And those reported cases are in the report, by the way, that goes to Congress and the Secretary of Defense. About 8% of the cases that were reported in the annual reports were not in the Navy's database, and about 82% of the cases for the Coast Guard were reported out, but not in their databases. So we made a recommendation that these three services have complete information on non-judiciary punishments. After discussions with them, there were some concerns about how they would do that. So the recommendation is actually to determine the feasibility, including the benefits and the drawbacks of having complete non-judiciary punishment data. We know that the Army and the Navy have moved forward and decided that they want to have this information, and perhaps you can learn more about that on the next panel. The Coast Guard plans to make a decision about the feasibility of collecting such data in September of this year.
All right, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cisneros. Ms. Holland, followed by Ms. Trahan, and finally Mr. Brown. Ms. Holland, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Chairwoman, I don't have any questions at this time for this panel, but I will be here for the next panel. Thank you. I yield back to you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Trahan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'll just put my bias out there. I don't generally believe that it takes years to change. I do believe that it happens closer to an instant, especially when we have a strong culture and strong leadership, which is something I believe we pride ourselves in. So that being said, I'll just ask the question to Colonel Christensen and Ms. Farrell. Do you believe convening authority should be left to commanders, or do you think that the current process increases the risk of unconscious or even overt bias within our military justice system? And I'll just add, my second question would be, do you believe that if the convening authority were transferred to a separate entity within the department, it could decrease the racial disparity highlighted in these reports?
Well, thank you for your question. While that is a core principle of mine, is that the military become part of the 21st century and have prosecutors make prosecution decisions versus convening authorities. I think the command-controlled system of military justice, as I talked about before, they know the people involved. It's going to cause a bias no matter how good the commander is, no matter how desirous they are of not having a bias. They're going to have a bias because they know the people who are making the that have been alleged to committed a crime. I think that bias is going to carry over throughout the process because of the way the chain of command works. If you have a convening authority system, when you have a convening authority system, they weigh very heavily on the views of the commander who knows the people who have committed the crime. A prosecutor-based system, which is not perfect, no system is, but as I said before, when I prosecuted a case, the first time I laid eyes on the accused is when I came into court. I didn't know who they were. Race wasn't an issue unless for some reason it was an identification issue as part of the report of investigation. And so I think it does not eliminate, but reduces the chance that racial biases will impact the decision made by the person deciding whether a case should go to trial or not.
And her second question? What was your second question, Ms. Trahan?
Thanks. It was I think Colonel Christensen answered it, but it was if he believes that the convening authority would transfer to a separate entity within the department, it would decrease the racial disparity. I'll ask Ms. Farrell if she has anything to add. Otherwise, I do have maybe just another follow-up.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. I would say, to answer your question, we need to see DOD's evaluation of the causes of the disparities at these different stages in order to pinpoint exactly what needs to be done in terms of correction along the lines that you're talking about.
And so are the commanders today who are holding convening authority, are they receiving training on these issues? Are we arming them with the tools to recognize racial disparities and ethnic inequities so that they may address them appropriately?
Well, that's probably a question better for the other panel to answer. My understanding is the Air Force has said they are now doing that. I don't know, but as the GAO report found in May of 2019, it doesn't seem like anything had been done by that time to find causes or solutions.
Okay, thank you. I'll wait for panel 2. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Trahan. Mr. Brown, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for allowing me to wave on to this panel. I'm going to have a longer statement to make before the second panel, so I'll just jump into some questions for our panelists, for Colonel Christensen and Ms. Farrell. Thank you for being here. I guess this is the concern I have looking at what we did in the NDA that asked GAO to study this issue, and then in the NDAA putting to the DOD to come back with an assessment of what the causes are. And here's the concern I have, so I need some help. Colonel Christensen, you said that you witnessed a case where a black man was 6 minutes late for formation. He was court-martialed. You never saw that with a white service member. When you talk about implicit racial bias, typically in that case, if you would have brought to that commander, hey, look, you just sent to court-martial a black guy, and in the last month, we've had 3 white guys, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes late, and you didn't do it. Often with implicit bias, that commander might say, wow, you're right. Let me take a look. It's often benign. It's unknown. When brought to the attention of the offender, if you will, they're willing to make corrective action. From everything, Mr. Christensen, that you said about your efforts to get information from DOD, their unwillingness to explore the causes of this disparate racial impact in military justice, I'm concerned that in the GAO study, we're putting to the DOD too much responsibility to come up with guidelines for how to address disparities, discover or research the causes of disparity, and develop a uniform set of demographic criteria or classifications so we can better understand it. Here's my question. What can Congress do today to ensure that DOD is doing these things in the GAO report that gets beyond the resistance that you and your organization, Colonel Christensen, have seen? What's some specific things that we should be doing?
Well, great start is what we're doing right now. It's definitely putting the DOD on notice that this is something Congress is concerned about. But I think Congress needs to send a message to the various services that they do not expect that this is going to be a quick solution. So, for example, my understanding is the Air Force IG wants to have the investigation wrapped up by the end of July. That's ridiculous. This is a decades-long problem. You're not going to find problems and solutions and causes in 2 months. Second thing is that Congress needs to make it clear to the DOD that they expect them to be reaching to outside entities to help with the solution. True experts on disparity, true experts on what causes racial bias, true experts on finding racial discrimination. And then as has been required in the most recent NDA, that they continue to report back to Congress with the same vigor that they do with the sexual assault report that is released each year. That has to have the same kind of detail, the same kind of depth to it.
Ms. Farrell?
Well, I'll pick up where Mr. Christensen left off in terms of external reporting. That's one of the recommendations that we have seen progress on in terms of DOD is expected to include, because of the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, DOD is expected to include demographic information in its annual reports going forward. So that's going to help with the transparency, but that's still quite a ways off. I think congressional oversight, periodic congressional oversight is going to be necessary. I agree that doing an evaluation of the causes is not something that can be done in just a few months. having a prioritizing where DoD is going to look at which stages in order to get behind, and also bring in consultants is going to be very important. The NDAA requires DoD to commence the study for evaluating causes this month. There's no end date. Again, it's going to be very important, I think, for the House Armed Services Committee, specifically this subcommittee and others, to have DoD brief or have another hearing to understand what progress they're making toward that final report on the causes.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you once again for allowing me to wave on.
That special and general court martials remain about the same for Black and white service members. Yet significantly more of Black service members are brought to court martial. That appears to show two things. One, that court martials are not convicting because of race but evidence. And two, that commanders are preferring charges on more Black service members for reasons other than the strong weight of evidence against them. I guess finally, let me just ask you, is that a fair statement?
I do think that's a fair statement. I honestly believe our court members tried to do the right thing, and that I don't believe I ever saw a single panel where I thought that they were racially driven in their verdict. I do worry, again, that the decision, really what we're talking about is that the white service member gets the benefit of the doubt. Their case doesn't go forward. Their case is handled at a different level than what the Black service members are.
Thank you. Ms. Farrell?
I did not hear all of that question, but I think you were asking questions related to what GAO identified at the beginning of the military justice process and what we see at the end, and it's quite a different picture. As we've discussed, actions are more likely to be identified at the very beginning of the judicial process when a service member is under investigation. When we look at outcomes in terms of convictions and punishments, for convictions, we found that there was no statistically significant difference among races in terms of conviction. And similar results for punishments, no statistically significant difference, except for Black service members in the Navy were less likely to be dismissed or discharged after a conviction. So they're at opposite ends of what we see in terms of disparities in the beginning of the system and where we see them end up at the end.
All right. Again, thank you both very much for your testimony. We'll take a short recess so we can bring our second panel to the table and hear from them. Welcome back, everyone. We will bring this hearing to order once again, and it's my pleasure now to introduce our next panel. We will start with Lieutenant General Charles Peedy, Judge Advocate General for the United States Army, followed by Vice Admiral John Hannock, Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Navy, Lieutenant General Jeffrey Rockwell, Judge Advocate General for the United States Air Force, and finally Major General Daniel Lecce, the Staff Judge Advocate to the Commandant of the Marine Corps. General Peedy, we will begin with you.
Ranking Member Kelly and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity.
I'm sorry, General, could you move that microphone a little closer to you, or?
Absolutely. How's that?
Better. Thank you.
Madam Chairwoman Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity. We meet on a topic of vital importance to our Army and to our nation, ensuring that every soldier who swears to defend our Constitution is guaranteed its foundational promise, equal justice under the law. This has been my charter across 32 years of service, and it is the commitment of the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps and the Army leadership. As recent events make clear, that promise remains unfilled for too many in our nation. Just 2 days ago, we in our Army celebrated its 245th birthday. Because of the service and sacrifice of many, I believe that today our Army represents our country's best ideals more than ever. Yet I also believe that, like the country we serve, there is still much more that must be done. Our hearing today reminds us of the origins of our Uniform Code of Military Justice. It was born out of a concern for fundamental fairness for those suspected of a crime. Our code's due process guarantees, zealous defense, impartial judges, and robust appellate review are its cornerstones. Over the years, and thanks to the work of many on this committee, the code has been reformed and improved, while its central purposes have been preserved, promoting justice while ensuring discipline. These are the pillars upon which our combat effectiveness rests, and they are the reasons why our Army is the best in the world. But as good as our justice system is, we can never take for granted its health or its fairness. It requires constant care by well-trained law enforcement, educated commanders, and qualified attorneys. Working together with the Congress, we have brought our justice system much closer to the full realization of equal justice for all. But close is never good enough. In May 2019, the GAO found racial disparities in our justice system. While it reached no conclusion on the causes of these disparities, this report raises difficult questions, questions that demand answers. Sitting here today, we do not have those answers. So our task is to ask the right questions and find the answers. I am joined by my partner in this effort, Major General, the Army's Provost Marshal General, my partner in this effort, Major General Kevin Vereen. General Vereen supervises our military police, our criminal investigators, and our criminal laboratory. Based on the GAO's findings, the effort to examine our system is a shared responsibility with us and with our commanders. As we assess this issue, from investigations to command decisions to the disposition phase, we must do so with a common framework and the right stakeholders. That effort must start with seeing ourselves. This began last year as we began implementing the GAO's recommendations. We are also working with the other services to execute Section 540I of the NDAA. That now visionary statute directs us to identify, investigate, and resolve potential disparities in justice. Finally, we continue to improve our internal data sharing. Recently, General Vereen and I established a link between his law enforcement database and our justice database, allowing a degree of interoperability and transparency that never existed before. These efforts began before the recent tragic events and the national conversation that followed our nation, or followed across our nation, and within our formations. As that conversation demonstrates, data alone cannot tell the full story. We must look beyond the data and ask the difficult questions. General Vereen and I, along with Army leaders, need to look hard at ourselves. With commanders, we must look at the causes. And we must understand how preconceptions and prejudice can affect both the investigation and disposition of misconduct. While my experience tells me we have an extraordinarily healthy system of justice, I also recognize we simply do not know what we do not know. And it is our job to discover what needs fixing and to fix it. To do this, I've directed a comprehensive assessment with the Provost Marshal General to get left of the allegation, left of the disposition decision, to examine why the justice system is more likely to investigate certain soldiers and what our investigations and command decisions tell us about this issue. Finally, we know that each of us is shaped by our own backgrounds and experiences. As the Secretary, our Chief, and our Sergeant Major recently reminded us, and which I echoed in my own message to my Corps, leaders of all ranks must listen with compassion and humility. I believe our justice system is one of the best in the world, but I also know it is not perfect. A justice system must be both just for and seen to be just by all. We have much to learn and more work to do. General Vereen and I, along with the Army leadership, look forward to working with this committee to understand the problem and to address it. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, General Petey. Admiral Hannock.
Chairwoman Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, thank you for the invitation to testify on the issue of racial disparity in military justice. Department of Navy guidance emphasizes several things about equal opportunity. The first is that sailors and Marines are our most precious resource. Second, that unlawful discrimination undermines a unit's ability to function effectively and cannot be tolerated. And third, that we must overcome any bias or any stereotype that diminishes cohesiveness, camaraderie, or morale. In a recent message to the fleet, Admiral Gilday, the Chief of Naval Operations, commented on this. He said, "In the Navy, we talk a lot about treating people with dignity and respect. In fact, we demand it. It's one of the things that makes us a great Navy." And then, observing recent events in our nation, Admiral Gilday added, "We can't be under any illusions about the fact that racism is alive and well in our country. And I can't be under any illusions that we don't have it in our Navy. We cannot have those illusions." And so the Navy emphatically and unequivocally denounces racism. It is antithetical to our core values of honor, courage, and commitment. It is antithetical to our obligation as service members to support and defend the Constitution and to help protect the rights afforded to all Americans. The military justice system must operate without discrimination, without racism. All sailors must be able to have confidence in the fairness of the system. The May 2019 GAO report identified some disparities related to race and ethnicity. To summarize those that were identified for the Navy, black sailors more likely than white sailors to be the subject of an investigation in the database used by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and other Navy law enforcement elements. The same for Hispanic service members. Black sailors were also more likely than white sailors to be tried by a general or a special court-martial. So were Hispanic sailors. When it came to assessing the results of court-martial, there was no significant difference between the conviction rates for black, Hispanic, or white sailors. And as the GAO witness noted on the last panel, for those found guilty, black sailors were less likely than white sailors to receive the punishment of discharge or dismissal. The GAO was correct that there may be disparities at different points in the system, and we appreciate the recommendations they made to help. When those are combined with the requirements of Section 540I of the FY20 NDAA, my hope is that will result in improved data collection, a process to determine when that data should be reviewed, and an evaluation to identify the causes of the disparities. Now, regarding data collection, the Navy and Marine Corps case management system has been updated to collect the race, ethnicity, and gender of victims and accused for each general and special court-martial. I have more work to do in 2 areas. The first relates to summary courts-martial. Because the Navy prosecution offices often are not involved directly in the summary courts-martial, and we are reviewing procedures needed to collect the associated data. And as the GAO witness observed, the second relates to non-judicial punishment. They recommended the Navy consider how we might maintain non-judicial punishment information in a database, and how to implement this recommendation remains under review. The Navy is also taking steps to prevent racial bias through training. This is not a panacea, but we can't let up. The Naval Leadership and Ethics Center provides training on unconscious bias for prospective commanding officers, executive officers, and other leaders. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service trains agents on diversity and inclusion, on unconscious bias, and cross-cultural communications to prevent racial profiling in investigations. We also provided training on unconscious bias and inclusion and diversity within the Judge Advocate General's Corps community. The Navy is committed to ensuring the military justice system is fair for everyone. And I look forward to working with you to improve our data collection and to identify, understand, and address these disparities. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Hannock. General Rockwell.
Madam Chair Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, distinguished members, thank you so much for the opportunity to address the importance of eradicating racial disparity in our military justice system to ensure fairness, inclusion, and diversity for all air and space professionals in the Department of the Air Force. An inclusive and diverse force is absolutely necessary to defend a diverse and inclusive nation. Like many of our civilian counterparts, we collect data on race in the military justice process. Our data shows that black male airmen below the rank of E5 and with less than 5 years' time in service are almost 2 times more likely to receive non-judicial punishment in Article 15 or face courts-martial. While we review specific cases to ensure there is not disparate treatment based on protected class, we don't have clear answers or underlying reasons as to why the disparity exists. Like all difficult issues the nation faces, solutions to address that disparity will require whole-of-government and societal approaches. We are committed to working with you to be part of that solution. Throughout our history, we have defended the nation, fought and won our wars because of 4 simple yet key components. First, the best people. Second, the best training. Third, the best equipment. And fourth, the most important element that binds us together, discipline. Discipline lies at the heart of what the nation expects of its military in the execution of our national defense missions. Discipline must be developed from day one. Discipline must also be earned by the military establishment by treating all of our members with dignity and respect, with equal opportunity to meet and exceed standards. We try to do that through inclusion, feedback, mentoring, along with the administration of progressive discipline when airmen make mistakes before they become a disciplinary statistic. As our Secretary-in-Chief recently stated, our diversity strengthens us as much as our common mission unifies us. The Department of the Air Force strives to foster a culture of inclusion and respect where every airman and space professional is valued for the talents he or she brings to the department, regardless of race, color, or creed. Our struggle against racism and other forms of discrimination cannot be viewed as finite battles. Rather, our approach must be infinite, a constant struggle for betterment. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, he set in motion racial integration of our armed forces. 25 years later, a 1972 task force found intentional and systemic discrimination in the military justice system. Many of the proposals identified then were adopted. Today, while we believe that we no longer have intentional discrimination in our processes, the fact is that racial disparity in the aggregate persists. This demonstrates the complex and challenging nature of the issue, symptomatic or indicative of one of many symptoms, a daunting problem, but one that should not stop us from exploring what we can do in the disciplinary process to serve as part of the solution set. Addressing it requires a holistic approach. Every day across the continuum of discipline, we are committed to finding new solutions and approaches. Every air and space professional, military and civilian, from the most senior to the most junior, is responsible for fostering and reinforcing a culture of inclusion, dignity, and respect. Like everything we do in the military, this requires a team effort, especially to get to the root causes of this difficult problem. We can frame an approach by asking ourselves 4 juxtaposing questions. First, while easy to say, our data merely reflects or is perhaps better than the society from where we come. What can we do in the armed services? Second, while easy to say, the specific cases show no actual disparate treatment in the decision made. Are we really including, mentoring, and administering progressive discipline equally to all before they become an Article 15 or a court-martial? Third, while easy to say, justice was colorblind in each of the cases. Are there administrative and substantive due processes which are discriminatory in treatment or impact? And fourth, finally, while easy to say, the data shows that the aggregate disparity disappears after the first 5 years in the force. What can we do to eradicate that disparity earlier and altogether? We look forward to working with the subcommittee on this most important issue.
Thank you, General Rockwell. General Lecce.
Madam Chair Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, members of the Military Personnel Subcommittee, thank you for your invitation to represent the Marine Corps on the issue of racial disparity within the military justice system. The Marine Corps is dedicated to ensuring equality throughout its ranks, from the most junior Marine through our senior leadership. Although we have come a long way, we recognize that much must be done. Several months ago, the Commandant sought a way forward to remove the public display of the Confederate battle flag from Marine Corps installations because of its divisiveness and association with hate and discrimination. 3 weeks ago, the Marine Corps issued a specific direction to the fleet to remove the Confederate battle flag from all Marine Corps installations across the globe. In his message to the Marine Corps regarding the Confederate battle flag's removal, the Commandant stated, quote, "Only as a unified force free of discrimination, racial inequality, and prejudice can we fully demonstrate our core values and serve as the elite warfighting organization America requires and expects us to be." To that end, the Commandant is committed to implementing the findings of the GAO report. The disparities the GAO highlighted in our administration of the justice system and the Marine Corps require immediate scrutiny and demand action. The implicit trust Marines place in one another make the elimination of racial inequality an imperative. As the Commandant stated, any form of racial inequality, whether it be direct, indirect, intentional, or unintentional, threatens the cohesion of the Marine Corps and must be addressed head-on. The GAO published 2 recommendations specifically addressed to the Department of the Navy. First, they recommended the highlighted need for our personnel, investigation, and military justice databases to use standardized data related to race, ethnicity, and gender. Second, and similarly, focused on standardized data collection for our non-judicial punishments and summary courts-martial. My written statement provides in greater detail the Marine Corps' specific actions and intentions stemming from the GAO's recommendations. Improved data collection brought about by changes within last year will help us to collectively and comparatively assess data to identify racial and ethnic disparities, but we will not wait for better data to address and fight inequality now. How we train, educate, and foster Marines within our Corps is paramount to ensuring the equality across our fighting force and within the military justice system. Training and education serve as the fundamental components of eliminating racial bias. To this end, the Marine Corps is pursuing inclusion of unconscious bias training curriculum at every level of professional development. Prospective commanders and senior enlisted leaders receive training on bias awareness through the Marine Corps University. Junior Marines receive comparable training from small unit leadership. Even our military justice have undergone similar training on unconscious bias within the past year. Such training and decisive senior leader action, such as the Confederate battle flags removal, may not resolve the disparities overnight, but our commitment and determination to ensuring equality among Marines remains steadfast and enduring. Thank you, and I look forward to working with you on this important issue.
Thank you, General Lecce. Thank you all for your testimony. I'd like to start by asking a simple question on transparency. We work for the public. And the fact that, General Rockwell, you fought the FOIA requests from Protect Our Defenders for over 3 years is deeply troubling to me, especially when it was said by the judge that this was at the aftermath of the Air Force manpower found that racial disparities are consistent, persistent, and getting worse. And the judge then said, when they attempted to get information about what you were doing about that, and you refused, the judge said this was an exercise which went nowhere. So tell me and the American people, who was benefited by not being forthright in complying with the FOIA request?
Well, Madam Chair, as you know, with FOIA, and you know the exemptions under FOIA, and you know in this case which FOIA exemption was invoked here. It was the deliberative process pre-decisional.
Yeah, but that's always used when people don't want to comply with FOIA.
And when, yes, ma'am, and when we looked at the underlying root causes, and of course the data was released, and the data showed exactly what you explained. The underlying reason, the root causes of the 11 or 12 people on the working group, there were 11 or 12 different answers as to what that root cause was. And that truly, ma'am, did fall into why we protect that.
Except you didn't do anything about it. That's the problem. You stand up this Air Force manpower to do this evaluation. They come back with a pretty compelling statement, consistent, persistent, and getting worse. And then you do nothing about it.
Yes, ma'am.
So how is that deliberative?
Well, it is consistent and has been since we've been collecting the data since '72. It is persistent because it is consistent. As far as it getting worse, it has pretty much stayed the same, at least in the Air Force across this time. One thing that we do know in the Air Force is to create this zone of innovation, this creative problem solving, these creative solutions, you have to give people, ma'am, the ability to really just look at this issue in different ways.
Well, I agree with you. I'm going to move on. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Admiral Hannock, the request for FOIA, the request was from, I think, 2006 to 2015. You provided only information and data from 2014 and 15. Why did you not provide the entire request?
Madam Chair, I'll have to take that question for the record. I know that we switched case management systems in about 2014, and I think it likely was dealing with the data and the amount of good data that we could deliver, but I'll get back to you with the final answer.
All right. Protect Our Defenders, when they came out with the report, found that the Air Force was 71% more likely to have black airmen face court-martial than whites. Army was 61%, Navy was 40%, the Marine Corps was 32%. Did any of you reach out to Protect Our Defenders to find out more about their study or how they could be helpful to you in dealing with this problem? General Petey?
Ma'am, I can't say today that I know specifically what communications we had with POD during that time. I can get that answer back to you, but I can't say right now.
Do you have any intention of working with them moving forward?
Ma'am, we've talked with POD. We've digested their materials. We've used it to inform us. But I think we also spent a fair amount of time, an extensive amount of time with GAO and its data requests as well. So we have a lot of people asking us for information. So we provide as best we can, and certainly in accordance with the rules, what we should provide to not only private organizations, but certainly government.
Thank you. I'm running out of time. Admiral Hannock, did you reach out to POD to learn more about their process or how they might be helpful?
Madam Chair, I did not. What I don't know is if anybody from our organization did, but I wish I had acted earlier.
Thank you. General Rockwell.
No, ma'am. We are very much looking forward, though, to seeing what the field thinks about this. And this is what's behind our IG independent review of this. We're able to talk to the very same people in the field that POD has been talking to with a multidisciplinary team to get this type of feedback of what exactly is going on and what are those root causes.
General Lecce.
Madam Chair, I did not, and I think that's an area where we can do better. We will work on that.
Do any of you think that someone should be court-martialed for being 6 minutes late to a formation meeting?
No, ma'am.
General Lecce?
Madam Chair, I mean, it would depend on the circumstances. I mean, if it was in combat, absolutely. I think if it was late for a meeting here in the Pentagon or in this chamber, the answer would be no, ma'am.
All right. My time has expired. Ranking Member Kelly.
I think we have to be real dangerous about using partial facts and partial figures. 6 minutes late is not a big deal unless it's 6 minutes late delivering an ordinance that saves thousands of troops. 6 minutes late is not a big deal if it's to a meeting with a subordinate, but it's extremely important if you're meeting with the President of the United States or the Secretary of Defense. 6 minutes late, if it is one time, is not a big deal. 6 minutes late if it's a pattern. So not knowing all the circumstances, whether it was 1 6 minute thing or the other, I think we're very dangerous. I think Colonel Christensen was very dangerous in saying that lawyers are less culturally biased than commanders. That is a very dangerous assumption. When he also said only 1 in 10 JAGs are African American, so we're lesser represented in the JAG Corps, but therefore we're culturally superior to the rest of these commanders. I think that's a very dangerous assumption to make. I think we have to be real clear. Here's what we know. We know E5s, people with 5 years and below, are treated differently if they're African American when they're in the armed services. We know that. So we know what we got to get after. We know that it seems the referral rates when they're tried to the conclusion are the same. So that doesn't necessarily mean that people are being referred that shouldn't. It may actually mean the opposite, but we don't know. So what we've got to do is, number one, figure out how do we quit being discriminatory, racially discriminatory, to E5s and below and people with 5 years of service. What do we need to do to remedy that situation? Number two is, we know we don't have African-American fighter pilots. We know that the promotion rates sometimes are slower to general officer or don't make general officer with African Americans or minorities. We know some of the reasons, and so we got to get after them. Anthony Brown has the Elite Act, which he's talking about. Because let me tell you what, if you're not a fighter pilot, you're probably not going to make general. If you're not a submarine or a surface ship guy or an aviator, you're not going to make admiral. You might. There may be some JAG Corps, some signal, some logistics officers that do. If you're in the Army, if you're not a tanker or infantry or a combat arms guy, you're probably not as likely to make general. We know this. And so what are we doing to get African-American kids into those branches where we know promotions happen, where you get the best schools because of the jobs that you do? What do we do to encourage them? What are we doing as the services to go after and make sure we got aviators who fly in the Navy, who come off the decks of those carriers? What are we doing to make sure that we got African-American pilots who want to be F-35 pilots, which is more likely a quicker track to being promoted to general than anything else? What are we doing to make sure that African-American soldiers at the E1 through E5 level are getting in the right MOSs, the right branches where promotions exist? That's what we got to do. And I don't mean to preach, but we got to get at the root of this stuff. We got to quit talking about some of these things that may be or might be. What we got to do, if you want to stamp out the problem, you got to figure out what the problem is. You got to figure out what the root cause is. And I think right now we are failing horribly at that. So with that being said, I want each of you to tell me, what are you doing in your service to figure out what the cause is, therefore, that we can make a change and a difference?
Congressman Kelly, thank you. I think from a recruiting and promotion perspective, I think there's an intense focus right now, and there has been. Our Chief of Staff Secretary instituted an information age talent management system last year, and that in part is designed to get after natural talent and talent that implicit bias might prevent from advancing. And so I think there's there's not just a fair amount of emphasis, there's significant emphasis. As I mentioned in my statement, I have directed with General Vereen a very deliberate assessment of trying to get left of the allegation. And what that means is if we have an overrepresentation coming into the investigative system, how do we get in front of that allegation to figure out what's happening when the soldier gets to the unit, such that they get in with, let's say, the wrong crowd, or they start using drugs, or they start misbehaving? What is going on there? Or perhaps what's just to the left of the disposition decision to send someone to trial? Is there something going on there? So we're looking hard at implicit bias. I take some comfort in this. When we started looking at implicit bias in the arena of sexual assault about 10 years ago, it is now replete through our training, not only commanders, but judge advocates throughout. And it, in my assessment, professional assessment, has had a significant impact on the understanding of counterintuitive behavior in sexual assault. We know training, education in implicit bias works.
Can you guys really answer really quickly, just like 15 seconds, on what you can do to change that? Because I'm out of time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kelly. First and foremost, I think we in the JEC need to fit in with the Navy's overall effort in a culture of excellence. It really is about emphasizing signature behaviors, the dignity and respect that you talked with. Second thing is we have focused on diversity recruiting. We have a dedicated diversity liaison program, 18 officers, closely affiliated with 13 diversity and educational organizations to try to keep connections so we keep that recruiting pipeline open. And then, like General PD talked about, focusing on unconscious bias. The reason that I think it works is because I remember the first time I took unconscious bias training in 2014. It was only later when I realized I had an unconscious bias against unconscious bias training. I think it can be effective, and I think we need to keep at it and keep moving that through the force.
All right, very quickly, please.
Ranking Member Kelly, we do it exactly the way you said it. You expand the discipline continuum from just courts in Article 15, and you go left. When you expand that zone and you look at that, how you discipline somebody, how you counsel somebody, how you include somebody, how you give them feedback is the holistic approach we have to take.
Ranking Member Kelly, very quickly, this has to be top-down driven, and the Commandant has done that with his recent action. Everybody has to get it, and it starts from the top, and he's driven that down. We also have done it with our PAC order, prohibitive activities and conduct order, that gets after discrimination. That's been on the books for 3 years. It involves the Equal Opportunity Advisor to the commander. It's a commander's program.
Thank you. Ms. Davis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And to all of you, we appreciate your joining us today. You know, I'm glad that my colleague, Mr. Kelly, talked about some of the issues that you've already identified. And one of them was about the 5 years. And I think that's very important. What I'd like to know is about the early warning signs. Is there an understanding that we really need to look at that, and that some of that information should be collected as well? Are there counseling sessions? Are there concerns about retribution? How do we begin to really understand that better, and how is that used? The other thing that I think we're all, excuse me, that we're all talking about right now is the element of white privilege. And I wonder to what extent is that an area of discussion that really can be broadened in the military as well. How is that talked about? Because as we well know, if you look at the data, there are plenty of ways of seeing and suggesting and really being open about how that affects us all, frankly. And I think we all have in our own experience those examples and how it might have been different if our son or our daughter was Black or brown. What does that mean? I think that's an important discussion to have in the services as well. And then finally, I just wonder, how do once we identify implicit bias, what do we do about it? I mean, if we're to go back into and looking at the progression of circumstances for someone and the outcomes, what is it about that? How do we identify it? And then what do we do? I mean, really, how talk about that a little bit as well. Thank you.
Do you want to start, General Lecce?
Madam Congressman, I believe it starts from the top, and I believe it starts with these honest and candid conversations in a safe environment. You can do this in the military. We believe in the Marine Corps that this is commander-driven and commander-owned, but you have to begin with those. You have to view diversity within the force as a strength, and that begins with the commandant all the way down to the most junior. You have to accept that as a strength, because at the end of the day, that's what the Marine Corps is about. It's about fighting as a team. Everybody on the team, regardless of gender, ethnicity, or race, is very important. And that's the bottom line. So as my colleagues have stated here, pathways and mentorship to young people, to look at the military, to look at the Marine Corps as a path for them. We have work to do there, but we can do that. These are things and steps that we're taking now. Thank you.
Ma'am, when I look at the numbers we have right now, and I see those numbers, and it makes you realize that the numbers are good data, at least from an Article 15 and a court standpoint. It's not evidence. It's not evidence to get to the root cause of the problem. So the last part of your question, how do we train on bias? So you look at the way attorneys always look at things. You look to weed out bias to get to the weight, relevance, and credibility of actual evidence. I think one of the approaches we must take is to develop more data left of Article 15. We don't have that data. We kind of know that's where the problem is. What we don't know and what we can't answer for sure is, are we mentoring everybody the same? We all feel that we probably aren't based on those biases, but we don't have the specific data to show that. Once you get that data, of course, you move on to the training, you move on to the speaking of bias, you move on to the training of that, you move on to weeding that out, and that all creates an atmosphere of inclusion. You create that atmosphere of inclusion, you've just created diversity.
Okay, thank you. Admiral Hannock, Ms. Davis has about 15 seconds, but we'll extend 15 seconds to each of you to finish your comments.
The only additional comment I would have is I think the value of unconscious bias training and other decision-making training is that you put yourself in the position where you can take different perspectives and you bring other people on your decision-making team as well. And that's very protective for the final decision maker and everybody on the team.
General Petty.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. I think you should know as well that the Army not only is focused at the squad level, in the squad level, according to our Sergeant Major and our Chief of Staff and Secretary, it's all about the team building, and it's all about inclusion, and it's all about bringing people onto one team so they all feel that they belong. And that gives you a better ability to diagnose where people are going left and right and center. And I think that focus by our Army leadership at every echelon all the way down is key to getting after this, especially when it comes to unconscious bias.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Halen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Kelly, for holding this hearing. And thank you, panelists, for being here. This is a significant problem that we absolutely need to fix. We must ensure the systems we utilize to administer discipline are fair and just for everyone. In the 1960s, my father served in the Marine Corps and experienced firsthand the maturation of the service into a fully integrated force, along with the racial tensions that flared up during that time. We've progressed since then, but we can all agree we still have a long way to go. It was disheartening to learn that despite the data presented in the 2017 Protect Our Defenders report and the 2019 GAO report, the services have responded with little more than unconscious bias training to address widespread racial disparities. Meanwhile, Black service members continue to receive non-judicial punishment at disproportionately high rates compared to white service members, and I have to believe that this is also a contributing factor to why we don't see service members of color achieve higher ranks, which is an issue this committee has consistently raised and which Ranking Member Kelly so eloquently articulated just a few minutes ago. General Rockwell, the Air Force spent nearly 3 years worth of resources, time, and energy refuting the Protect Our Defenders report and preventing the data from being made available to the public that time. And those resources could have been spent accepting that there is a major problem and tackling it head on. It's clear the racial disparities within our military justice system requires more than just a disparity board that met for 90 days to try to resolve it. So one of my questions, I have a few. Will this include will all of the work that you mentioned earlier about addressing these long-term issues, will this include improving the collection of data on race and ethnicity to make it more uniform across the services so it's easier to identify problems?
Yes, ma'am, it will. We are making a conscious effort to, again, move that left of that Article 15 and court-martial on the continuum and collect data, collect meaningful data of inclusion and feedback and mentoring. I think that's critical to getting to the root cause of the issue here.
Thank you. And what is the timeline for actions to be taken? If you could just reiterate that, General Rockwell.
We're doing it now, ma'am, and right now the projected timeline with the group that has been put together with our manpower and reserve affairs and personnel that we're a part of is calendar year 20.
Okay, thank you so much. And last question, well, maybe the last question, General, depending on my time. How will the progress be measured?
I think ultimately you measure progress by eliminating that racial disparity. You get to where we are right now in the Air Force at the E5 level with 5 years in, where there is no disparity. I think that has to be the ultimate goal of where we should get to.
Thank you so much. And I have a little bit of time, so I will ask this next question. I understand the Inspector General will be leading a review on racial disparities and causal factors like culture and policies. The scope and demographic makeup of this review panel can certainly make a difference in its effectiveness and what its recommendations look like. Can you describe the makeup of the panel?
I don't have the full details. We have 3 members on that panel, but it is fundamentally a large panel. It has general officers on it who are Black and African American. It has chiefs on it, senior enlisted who are African American, and it is multidisciplinary and multi-diverse. The idea is to get left of Article 15. And to get to that, there are so many different factors that need to be looked at. And I think what's going to be key is reaching down into what people feel on the ground. And that's really the focus of what they're trying to get to.
Thank you so much. Madam Chair, I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Holland. Mr. Cisneros, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all, gentlemen, for being here today. We have a problem in this country with sentencing in the civilian, law enforcement there, our criminal justice system. People of color tend to get longer sentences than white individuals do. Is this something we're looking at in the military as well? We know we have a problem with E5s and below going to court martial or receiving NJP more often than white service members do. But are we looking at the sentencing, and really are these individuals of color being sentenced more harshly than their white counterparts?
Sir, I'll go first. As we looked at this issue with regard to the GAO report, as a matter of fact, black airmen are sentenced less severely than white. I think that indicates, and that's both with Article 15 punishments and court-martial sentences. I think all that tells us is this issue is much more complex than we can really wrap up.
General, that was, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was for more senior members about E5 or above E5, right? I'm talking about the more junior ranks.
No, sir, even the E1 to E5 ranks where you see the racial disparity. When you break it down further in the Air Force, white airmen are actually punished and sentenced more severely than black airmen.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, ma'am.
In the GAO report, it said that black and male service members were more likely than white and female service members to be tried in summary courts martial and to be subject of non-judicial punishment in the Air Force and the Marine Corps. How does that square with what you said, General?
Yes, ma'am. That's in venue selection. More go to that venue, that court-martial. But at the end of it, when they are actually, if they are convicted and punished, their sentences are less in the Air Force. And again, ma'am, I don't know what that means. It's just as you pull apart the data and analyze it, that's what we see in the Air Force. I don't know if that's the case in the other services.
If I could, for the other services, if I could take those answers for the record. I have another question regarding the collection of data in regards to NJP and commanding officers. As we're doing the NJP, as you're collecting this data, are we collecting individual data for these commanding officers and looking at their records and trying to find these racial disparities and how they're dishing out punishment? And if so, if we're starting to see these racial disparities in the punishment that they're issuing, are they being counseled at all? And anybody could take that question. I'd like to hear from everybody if I could.
Congressman, this is General Petey from the Army. I think the short answer is if we looked at our data collection today, we do not track that.
I can't hear anything right now.
My mic is activated. Can you hear me okay?
Okay, I hear you now.
Okay. Yeah. Sir, this is General Petey from the Army. Sitting here today, we do not track a particular commander's dispositions by commander by race. And so I think in terms of our reflections on how we get after the notion of potential bias, whether unconscious or deliberate, that is part of, I think, our assessment. When General Vereen and I talk about how a law enforcement officer reacts at a scene of domestic violence or how a commander disposes of non-judicial punishment, I think this is one of the areas that we look at. I would tell you, though, in practice, as a practicing judge advocate in the field for 32 years, those indicators are evident to any judge advocate or other leader at echelon, whether it's a brigade commander or a division commander. They see things in their formation, especially particular commanders who are doing things that appear to them odd or suspicious or curious. I myself, in only one occasion in 32 years, remembers a commander in such a circumstance as you suggest. It's worth looking at. I think we have to, and I think it's a responsible thing to do in our assessment. Thank you, sir.
With that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back my time, but I would like to hear a response on the record from the other judge advocate generals. Thank you.
All right, we'll ask that you prepare a response for the record. Thank you, Mr. Cisneros. Now, excuse me, Ms. Trahan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And in case it wasn't clear before, I do want to say for the record that I'm grateful for the leadership of Chairwoman Spear and the MilPERS subcommittee, because back in 2012, when addressing sexual assault and harassment reporting, I think it led to substantive changes in the DoD culture. But when it comes to equality and justice, I mean, we are an impatient nation. So I'm going to ask the same question that I asked before in terms of convening authority. And if you believe convening authority should be left to commanders, or do you think that the current process increases the risk of unconscious or even overt bias within our military justice system?
Ms. Trahan, can you return to the video portion? We don't see you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
Can you
all right.
see me now?
Now we see you now.
Thank you.
Ma'am, this is General Petey from the Army. You've probably heard me say this before, but I have complete confidence in our commanders to administer justice fairly and dispassionately, especially at the senior levels. It's not that I don't have faith in lawyers. I love my Corps. I love the judge advocates we recruit, train, and educate, and nurture and culture. But there's no monopoly on bias or unbiased. There's no monopoly on wisdom in your legal branches. I look to the federal and the state sector, and I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus, but that's a lawyer-controlled system. And by any measure, whether it's the Sentencing Project or DOJ Bureau of Statistics, the racial disparities in those systems are well in excess of what you find in the military services. That's not by way of excuse, but that's a lawyer-controlled system, so I don't believe the answer is lawyers. I believe the answer is a set of cross-checks and balances between law enforcement, commanders, and lawyers looking at each other in the system and keeping each other honest. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Or anyone have a different view? Okay, then I'm going to go to my question. Given that I'm sure you're all looking inward with a lot of urgency. One of the GAO's findings was that while Black and Hispanic males were more likely than white servicemen and women to be tried in general and special courts martial across the services, race was not a statistically significant factor in the likelihood of conviction. And so I'm wondering, what do you believe that data says about the military justice system? Could it indicate that the bias is more prevalent amongst our junior leadership ranks who are recommending service members for NJP or courts martial than amongst the senior leaders who are ultimately sentencing them?
Congresswoman, I think this goes back to the first question, and you can really dovetail the answer into the first question of what you just asked. When you look at what a commander does of setting the tone, and then the commander setting that command climate, you look at this issue, and we think we know where the answer is, where the targets are, where the targets of opportunity are. That is left of 15. We know then that where this has to happen, where the unconscious bias needs to be eliminated, where the mentoring and the inclusion happens is that first line E5 supervisor over those E4 and below airmen. And when you look at setting that command climate, knowing a commander has to do that, and then letting that supervisor do that, that's where we need to focus the help, the training, the data, and everything we need to collect.
Did anybody else want to add anything to General Rockwell's comments?
Well, I think, Madam Congresswoman, I think from the Marine Corps perspective, there's two pieces. The GAO report was pretty clear that although they show bias in the data, it cannot conclude unlawful bias because we don't fully understand the data. So I think, number one, to General Petey's point, we have to kind of get left of the problem and figure out what this data exactly means. But second, and more importantly, and something that the Commandant has made clear, is that commanders have to get after this and setting the tone, training and educating their subordinate personnel about the importance of this, of equality and diversity in the force and how that makes us stronger. And I think that's something that the Commandant himself has really gotten after and that we're taking very seriously in the Marine Corps.
Well, I appreciate all that. I mean, certainly what you want to back up the data with, a root cause analysis along all of those sort of stage gates. And I understand that the Air Force is going to be completing anonymous surveys. General Rockwell, will those findings of the surveys, will those be public?
Yes, Congresswoman, I imagine they will be. I'll defer all that to the IG who is running it, so we do get an independent look at this. But yeah, I can't believe those results will not be open and transparent.
All right, Ms. Trahan's time has expired. Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I want to thank you and the ranking member, Representative Kelly, for allowing me to wave on this afternoon. I want to thank each of our panelists for testifying today. I want to thank you for your service to our nation and in our armed forces, and for your stated commitment to end racial disparities in our military justice system. We are at a difficult time in our nation's history, a time when racial injustice is seen in the violence against Black Americans by local law enforcement, a time when persistent racial disparities in health are illuminated by the stark contrast we're witnessing in the disproportionate prevalence of COVID-19 death and infection among Black and brown Americans, a time when almost every racial disparity experienced in this nation, in our educational systems, our criminal systems, our workforce, are compounded by this pernicious pandemic. And today we're at a difficult time in America's military. An institution that led this nation in racial integration almost 75 years ago is now confronted with growing white nationalism in our ranks. An institution that saw the first African-American first captain at West Point 40 years ago, now retired Army General Vince Brooks. Yet it took until last week before we could confirm our first African-American service chief, General Brown of the Air Force, and we still have a military whose 61 four-star flag officers only include 2 African-American officers among them. An institution that benefited from the courageous service of nearly 1,000 pilots during World War II who completed the Tuskegee training program, yet today there are only 446 minority fighter or bomber pilots and navigators in the armed forces. Less than 2% of our pilots are African American. An institution that after World War II in 1951 began to operate under the UCMJ, which in many ways has been way ahead of the changes, the positive changes in the civilian criminal justice system in terms of the rights of the accused and of defendants, yet today grapples with racial disparities in the disciplinary treatment of men and women in uniform. That is where we are today in our nation and in our military, and it cannot be where we are tomorrow. We have work to do, and we need to do it now. Gentlemen, I take a lot of stock in the work of the GAO, and they came back, I thought, with a thoughtful report and list of recommendations on how we can get better. And my question is, what more do you need from Congress in order to complete your evaluation of the causes of any disparities in the military justice system? And are you consulting any outside resources that have expertise in this area in order to complete this evaluation? We can start with the Army. We'll go down to the Air Force, then the Navy.
General Petey.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Congressman Brown, thank you so much for the question. As to what we need from Congress, I think, as I mentioned in my statement, the care and attention, the desire, the passion you bring to these issues to help us help ourselves, to see ourselves is critical. So I think that will continue. I know it will. And I want you to know personally, I welcome it, and so does the Army leadership. With respect to outside resources, sir, we're sort of, with respect to causality, we're in the very early stages of figuring out what can cause this. So we're developing a framework, well, this very week and last week to figure that out. I fully expect that will include outside assistance. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Admiral Hannock.
Sir, I think Section 540I of the NDAA was an excellent roadmap. I think that point was emphasized by the witness from the GAO. I think the focus on data collection and then solid assessment, understanding, and then what to do about the disparities is the right way ahead. I agree with General Petey on outside assistance. I think that it's going to be important this look be deliberate, that it be thoughtful, and it's not going to be over quick. We're going to have to continue this effort, and that's where I think the outside resources can be incredibly helpful.
General Rockwell.
Sir, I have a lot of faith in what our IG independent review is going to do. I have a lot of faith that they're going to look at this internally and holistically. I also have a lot of faith in our manpower and reserve and A1 team who's leading the effort. Now, you asked the question about what kind of outside help we're getting. That manpower and personnel team is getting a lot of outside help. So I have quite a bit of faith in that to see what else can we do to get to this elusive solution set here.
General Lecce.
Mr. Congressman, I don't believe at this time we need any help from Congress, but I appreciate the opportunity to testify here. We just have a lot of work to do. We just have to get after this. We realize that we're at the beginning. We're looking at data. We're trying to understand the data, but there's a lot of hard work that has to be done. And again, I keep, the Commandant is my boss. I keep mentioning him because he has made this an important plank in his commandancy, and he's driving it. And I think that that's what we need throughout every echelon of the Marine Corps. Commanders need to drive this. They need to make it important. And I think that starts these candid and open conversations about how we get after this. And that's what the Marine Corps is doing.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Kelly, do you have any final words? No, ma'am. All right, generals and admirals, thank you so much for your participation today and for your commitment to the rule of law. Let me just end with a few comments. 540I was put into the NDAA not by you, not at your request, but at Congress's request. So while you're relying on that now to recognize that there is work to be done, it would have been a whole lot better if it had come from you. General Lecce, you've said it a number of times, it starts at the top, and you are right. And I hope you convey to all of your chiefs of staff how critical this is to the Congress of the United States. General Petey, you said that much like sexual assault and sexual harassment in the military, we have to focus on this with the same laser focus that we have provided for that issue, and I agree with you. We are at a transformational point in this country, civilian and military-wise. And I think that there is a lot of work to do. There's a lot of data that has to be collected, but we have to make sure it is consistent across all of the services and that there is transparency. I hope that we don't have to have another hearing where we have outside groups coming to us and saying we can't get the information. The GAO, in a number of circumstances, said she couldn't get the information. We have to be forthcoming to the American people. We intend to continue this work. We will have you back to see how you're doing in hopes that you're going to be making great strides in dealing with the anti-racism that we have to imbue in society generally. And with that, we stand adjourned. Even though we had to come here to do it.
Well, I was up last week too, so I'll be back next week. We got more. Then we got three more, I think, Friday. We'll see you next week.
See you next week. Pre-market, we're going to do that staff level.